Welcome, friends, and thank you for joining our August 2023 edition of the Online Discussion Forum. I'm your host, C.L. Pierce, the Director of Admissions here at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. As always, we have Dr. Ligon Duncan with us today. He is our Jackson Campus President, CEO, and Chancellor of Reformed Theological Seminary, leading our discussion. We have back with us today, no stranger to the Online Discussion Forum, Dr. Mike Hillerman. Mike is the Director of Reformed Theological Seminary's Master of Arts in Counseling program that's located here in Jackson and at our Orlando campus. If you have someone in your life that may be interested in counseling ministry or a career in counseling as a licensed professional counselor, we would love to serve them. Both campuses are now receiving applications for the summer 2024 counseling cohorts. If you or someone you know might be interested, I'll be providing contact information, application deadlines, and other important dates in the chat shortly. As always, we have lots of free resources to give away, and thanks to our friends at Crossway, we have more than 50 of Charles Spurgeon's Encouragement for the Depressed to give away. Also, we like to give a large stack of related resources on today's topic on anxiety. First up, we have Edward Welch's A Small Book for the Anxious Heart. Secondly, Zach Eswine's Spurgeon's Sorrows, A Realistic Hope for Those Who Suffer from Depression. Next up is a book from Dr. Kevin DeYoung at the RTS Charlotte campus. We have Crazy Busy. The next book is some practical wisdom from the ministry of Richard Baxter's life, a book called Depression, Anxiety, and the Christian Life. The next book is actually a 31-day devotional for teenagers called Anxiety, Finding the Better Story by Liz Edrington. Next up is John Piper's When the Darkness Will Not Lift, doing what we can while we wait for God. Enjoy. Next up is a couple of books that kind of go together. They're both written by David Murray. One book is a bit of a parent or a minister's guide to ministering to teenagers who are wrestling with anxiety and depression, and the other book is for the teenager. These books are called Why Am I Feeling Like This? And Why Is My Teenager Feeling Like This? The last book we have to give away today is Eric Johnson's God and Soul Care, the Therapeutic Resources of the Christian Faith. Now, to enter the giveaway, just say hello in the chat. And as always, we leave the last half hour for participant questions. And if you have a question today, we're using a new Q&A feature. If you'll look at the bottom of your screen next to the chat, you should be able to click on the Q&A icon, type in your question there, and click send. That's all the announcements I have today. Before we get started, let's ask the Lord's blessing. Please pray with me. Lord, thank you for your heart of compassion towards us. Our topic today for many of us is very, very real. Our world is riddled with all kinds of anxiety and fear, and this troubles us, and some of us, we struggle mightily. I ask that today's discussion would give us resources to help calm our own fears and equip us to help others as we're salt and light in our own communities. I pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Dr. Duncan, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, CL. Thank you for organizing this. And I'm speaking to everyone from the Chancellor's office at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson. We don't have a main campus in the RTS system, but we do have an institutional headquarters, and it's here in Jackson. And for the very first time in the last week, I've gotten into my office. We started moving into this new facility back in April, but my office was completed last week. Gene Whitehead, who is just fantastic at design and artwork and decoration. Worked with Bob Bailey on The Office, and I'm very thankful for their work. And so I'm sitting at a table that was given to me by the elders of First Presbyterian Church in Yazoo City. It's their old session room table, and when they got a new table, they put it in storage. And when Bob was working on the project, he said, "Hey, I think I know where we can get a table." So thank you to the friends in Yazoo City who made that provision, and I look forward to welcoming many of you here in Jackson when you get through. With me today is Mike Hillerman, and he is in his office in our state-of-the-art counseling center here in what we call the 1400 building, because it's if my blinds were open, which CL asked me to close, you'd be able to see the building out of my window. It's closer to Meadowbrook Road. And we have a wonderful counseling center there. Ron Jeanette Taylor is probably sitting in her office in the counseling center right now, too. Mike, you want to say just a few words about the counseling center? We had an open house on Tuesday night, and a lot of people came through and were super impressed, including graduates who said, "Oh, could I please use these facilities again?" Tell us just a little bit about the counseling center.
Oh, it's a wonderful resource for the city and for our students. It has 15 counseling rooms in it. It has state-of-the-art technology for us to help students learn about counseling as we kind of show them themselves as they're working with clients. It has a modern, very bright, comfortable waiting area. It's really got everything that we asked for, and really puts RTS in a position where its counseling students will be able to serve the city of Jackson for many years to come.
Yeah, we're very excited about that, and I'm thankful for Mike's leadership of the program and that he would be here today, because he's got, I think, either class or some professional responsibility right on the heels of this meeting. So let's get right into it, Mike. We've said we wanted to talk a little bit today about anxiety in the Christian life. So the right place to start is for you to just tell us, what is anxiety?
You know, I've thought about how to answer that question, and I think I'm going to tell just a brief story, try to exemplify it. So my wife and I, Christy, we like to go camping, and we did a lot more of that in our younger days. And there was a particular trip we were on. We were in the mountains in the Sierra Nevada. And my wife woke me up in the middle of the night, and she had this urgency in her voice. And all I heard her say was, "Bear." And now we're in a tent that's made of nylon fabric that's about 1 millimeter thick, if that. And I, have a moment where I start to listen in the dark, and I for sure hear the grunting of some large beast outside of our tent. And then I heard sniffing. And I started to experience some physiological changes, we might say. That bear was sniffing a fanny pack that we had left on the picnic table outside of our tent that had yesterday's lunch in it, the remnants of it. And then I listened to the bear begin to tear that canvas pack open, right? So you can hear the tearing of the fabric as this beast is looking for some dinner. So that all, of course, ended fine, right? In California, where we were, the bears are black bears. They don't bother human beings. There's really no actual danger. And what we experienced, there was a lot of fear because there was this imminent perceived threat. So when we talk about what is an anxiety, the concept of perceived threat is an important aspect of it. The difference, though, between fear and anxiety happened a few years later. We went on a different camping trip. We went to Glacier National Park in Montana, and it's on the Idaho-Montana border up near Canada. And we pulled into the campsite. We got our little brochure from the ranger there and were assigned a campsite. So we drove to it and we were reading through the brochure. And in the brochure, it starts telling us things like this area has active brown bears, grizzly bears. They do come through the campsites, and you should not sleep in the clothes you cooked your dinner in, because they could potentially enter your tent. So there are multiple maulings in this particular national park each year. So there wasn't actually a bear anywhere around us in that moment, but I was experiencing a different physiological response as I'm reading this brochure, right? And what I'm doing is I'm thinking about a possible future threat that was even scarier than the one I woke up to in California a few years back. And so there's kind of a picture of anxiety is when our brain perceives some kind of potential future threat. And when it does that, it tends to activate a bunch of systems. One of the things that it does is it turns on what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And that involves things like increasing heart rate, your mouth gets dry, your breathing gets shallow and fast, your stomach stops digesting, you start secreting stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. So there's all this stuff that happens physiologically because your brain perceives threat and it's trying to get your body ready to run, fight, or respond to the threat in some way. Now, how does that intersect with what we think of as anxiety in a mental health kind of context? And it actually physiologically isn't any different. The perceived threat isn't always something that we're even aware of. It's sometimes something happening in our mind that we don't have kind of a conscious handle on, but that our brain is reacting similarly, right? And of course, there's degrees of this. It may not be, worried about a grizzly bear, but there's some kind of perceived threat. It's activating this anxious response.
And is there a relationship between anxiety and depression, Mike?
There is. In fact, for a while, there was an effort to kind of merge those things because they do have some common symptoms. For example, both can result in altered sleep patterns, right? You may find that you sleep less or sleep more in either one of those. Your appetite can be affected by both of those. And there's a few other symptoms like that kind of both anxiety and depression can activate. The other thing is that one can kind of cause the other. So if you've been really depressed before and you start to feel depressed again, you can start getting anxious about kind of going back into that dark depression you had before, right? Likewise, if you've been anxious for a long time, you can become depressed about feeling so anxious all the time, right? So they kind of co-occur with each other. There is but they are distinct. At least that's how we think of them today, as they are distinct things.
Now, Mike, the Bible talks a good bit about anxiety. You've given us sort of a clinical angle into it. Talk to us a little bit about how those things might intersect.
So Jesus says very frequently that we should not be anxious. And if you read the commentaries on that, it's a kind of an anxious carefulness. We're kind of anxiously careful is kind of what the language there is trying to get across. And that the connection here is that, well, I talked about anxiety in terms of our response to perceived threat, and I gave examples that are primarily things outside of our own volition, right? There is a type of anxiety that comes from our own volitional. We are ruminating, for example, on, am I going to be able to feed myself? Am I going to be able to take care of my family? Am I going to get the promotion I hope for? Am I going to be able to find a spouse one day? These things that we can kind of spend a lot of time ruminating on and worrying about, and that can lead to anxiety. And the Bible is really clear that that's not what we are to do. That what we're to do is to trust that God will care for us and provide for us all that we need.
Mike, you have told us before that anxiety is one of the common things that you and our wonderful staff and students encounter with clients that come to the clinic. What are some common causes of that anxiety?
Wow, that's a really good question. The kinds of anxiety that people experience that come to see someone like me often are things that they have tried to resolve on their own. They've often prayed about their anxiety for long periods of time. They have talked to friends and family, perhaps pastor, medical doctor sometimes. They're trying to be obedient to the word of God to not be anxious, and they have been unsuccessful in changing that. And when that's going on, sometimes that's related to some kind of volitional ruminating kind of thing. But often that's related to experiences that they've had earlier in their life that had a profound shaping impact on them, and that caused them at some very low level to believe that they were there was some kind of threat, and that can be a general sense that the world is a very dangerous place, and that they cannot care for themselves or protect themselves, and so they feel like they're in this constant state of vulnerability. They may feel, some people have a sense of, I talked about this in the article recently that just got published in Ministry and Leadership, a situation where this person was anxious because they had had a lot of success in life in many ways, and had attributed that to their faith. But then when they encountered a situation where they experienced significant failure, they suddenly had this kind of question of, well, what does this say about my status with God? And so there was this kind of idea that I'm okay with God, and the way I know that I'm okay with God is because of all the success that I have had in my life. And then when failure came along, suddenly there was this question about, well, maybe I'm not okay with God. And so that's another type of common type of problem that we'll see in the clinic sometimes.
So no doubt when you're talking to a client who's experiencing anxiety, one of the things you're wanting to do is try and identify causes, but you're also wanting to be aware of what the effects of anxiety may be in that person's experience. What are some of the effects of anxiety, Mike?
So anxiety, well, there's different ways to answer that question. Certainly, there's a whole set of symptoms that the person experiences. Anxiety, when it's chronic, and that's often what I'm having to see, is kind of like, think of it almost like experiencing chronic pain, right? You don't want it, you wish it was gone, but you don't know how to get rid of it, right? And then you wake up and every day it's there, and there's this, and that's where depression can sometimes come. So anxiety, when it's in its kind of chronic form, can have the effect of really causing the person to question all kinds of things, right? They can question, why am I having to experience this so much? Does God actually love me? I mean, I know he loves the world, but does he actually love me? How can I reconcile these things? It can affect relationships, marriages, relationships between parents and children in significant ways. So it can be different, of course, by individual, but in general, it can be a pretty profound effect.
What are some of the things that you do to help remedy anxiety in clients that come to see you, Mike?
The very first thing that I do is and it seems so simple, is I listen to what they're anxious about. So here, let me go back to the story in the tent. Imagine if my wife had woken me up and said, "Bear," and I said, "You're just being irrational, Christy. Like, just go back to sleep. We're going to be fine." And I rolled over and went back to sleep. That likely would not have decreased her anxiety, right? Probably would not have worked out well for me either. So what do? Like, you listen, you take seriously what that person is telling you. I mean, if you have someone talking to you who experiences chronic anxiety that's impacted their life in profound ways, it's serious. And it's not something that can be changed easily, because if the person could change it easily, they probably would have by now. They don't want to be in it, generally. So the first thing I do is I listen, and I listen carefully. I listen with a lot of curiosity. I've had clients often tell me after they're done working with me, I ask them a question. I say, what was helpful to you while you were working with me? And also, what was maybe not so helpful? And one of the more common things I hear about the helpfulness of it is, you were so curious about what I was experiencing, what I was saying, what I was trying to say. And that curiosity drew out of me things I didn't even know were in there. And so listening with curiosity, with dignity, like extending that person dignity and respect as they try to describe what they're experiencing, what they're thinking, why they're anxious, if they even know why, the effect that it's had on their life. Often, just their ability to express that to another person who takes it seriously and cares about it and gives them kind of time to work through it, that can have an effect that improves it doesn't necessarily eliminate their anxiety, but it can kind of bring it down. Another thing that I do, Ligon, is I teach clients some really practical skills that help reduce anxiety. So I mentioned earlier that when we're anxious, there's this thing called our sympathetic nervous system gets activated. Well, there's another kind of half to our nervous system, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And so when that part of our nervous system is activated, it causes us to breathe slowly and deeply. Our heart rate slows down. Our stomach starts to digest again. Stress hormones are no longer secreted, and our systems that kind of pull those hormones out of the bloodstream are able to kind of clear that. So if you can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, you will experience a physiological decrease in anxiety. So how do you do that? One of the things that is impacted by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic is breathing. And that is also one of the few things that we can control, right? We can't control secretion of stress hormones. We can't control our heart rate, right? But we can control how slowly or rapidly we're breathing and how deep or shallow we're breathing. And if you can teach a person to be able to comfortably control their breathing such that they're taking slow, deep breaths. And if they can do that, and it gets kind of a little tricky. Sometimes people start to kind of hyperventilate, or they'll kind of feel lightheaded, and that's not really working right. But if they can find a comfortable way of doing it, and they can do it over a period of 5 to 10 minutes, the decrease in anxiety is often quite surprising to them. And then when they realize, hey, I actually have some control over how much anxiety I feel in the moment, that decreases their anxiety about being anxious in the future. Those are probably two practical things I'd say.
It seems like I read fairly regularly about the increase of anxiety in our society, and especially amongst young people, Mike.
Yes.
You know, that sort of, you know, people's unprecedented levels of anxiety amongst young people.
Yes.
What's going on? You know, what's, you know, I know you work on this and you think about it and you read about it. What for those of us who are attending to people in churches and in paraministries, what's going on out there that's increasing the anxiety?
Well, we have some idea of this, but I think this is going to be one of those things that we'll figure out down the road and then look back on. There's an old saying, every time you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. And the increase in anxiety strongly correlates right now to the year 2012 when the smartphone hit the market. That's the single biggest empirically kind of oriented data point we have. Anxiety rates started to really kind of, the trajectory of anxiety changed at that point. And you know, is that the phone itself? Is that the social media you were interacting with on the phone? Is it the kind of news and other media that comes? I don't know the answer to that, Ligon. I don't know that we know yet, but if I had to bet on it, I'd say that it's going to be related to the smartphone.
Wow. That's, you know, I think all of us have had our eyes on social media, and I think a lot of people have been paying attention to smartphone and other types of technology like that. But the correlation of that to some other things that have been happening in our society since 2012 is remarkable. And again, it shows you that a lot of the things that are going on, you don't necessarily have control over, but they have a profound effect on how you experience reality. And that's a good one. And thankfully, there are a lot of smart people that are paying attention to that, working on that, researching that right now. But that's for parents and for others. Note to self on that. That's a big deal.
There's a big Ligon, when you mentioned parents, there's a big push right now to limit access to smartphone and social media on smartphone to children. Like change the minimum age for that to something close to like 16. Yeah.
What are some of the common misconceptions that you encounter about anxiety, Mike?
Well, I think the biggest that I encounter from people who are anxious themselves is they have this idea that they should be able to just switch it off. They don't understand why they can't just stop being anxious, and there's this sense that they should be able to do that. And I am, you know, often tell students, I think I've said it here in this forum before, I really believe that Christians underestimate the effects of the fall and how profound those effects are and how broken we are. And so at one level, right, we are not meant to be anxious. We are not made to be that way. But some of us are affected in by any manner of things. We could be genetically predisposed to it. It could be that we had some pretty terrible experiences growing up that made us more prone to anxiety. It could be that we live in a situation right now that is legitimately threatening, and therefore we're whatever it is. That anxiety is usually happening for very good reasons, and it's not a simple or easy thing to just shut off. That's maybe one of the biggest things I would say. Not that we can't. There are ways to address anxiety and help people stop being anxious, but it's not easy for someone with chronic anxiety.
You have some advice and counsel to us in terms of do's and don'ts about how to help and encourage somebody who's struggling with anxiety?
You know, when you when you have a person, if you're if you're a pastor or other kind of leadership position in ministry, and a person confesses to you anxiety, I think I'd kind of I'd encourage you to think about something that Diane Langberg has said that I really appreciate. And she said that when you are engaging with a person who's in distress like that and confiding that to you, the Lord is obviously, we hope, at work in what we say to that person. But what we often fail to realize is that the Lord is at work through that person in us. That this encounter is happening for some reason for us as well. And how are we responding to it? And what's the kind of inclination of our heart towards this person? And so I think the first thing is to kind of be aware of how am I responding to this person? How is this kind of description of anxiety affecting me? I had one person, Ligon, who had chronic anxiety. I saw her for a little while, tell me that she had talked to a pastor for a while who had told her that he questioned whether she was a Christian because she was unable to stop being anxious. So now she has the anxiety that was already there, and on top of that, she has this concern that her pastor wonders if she's saved. And I don't know that pastor. I don't know what was going on there, but I wonder if maybe that pastor was feeling some frustration that the things that he was saying to that parishioner were not being helpful, and didn't have another way of, couldn't think of this as in any other way of, well, the only answer I've got here is that maybe you're not saved. So kind of, accepting that sometimes things take longer and are harder to change, and that it can be uncomfortable for us to have to go through that with another person. And when it's uncomfortable, that's that kind of, well, what is God doing in my life and then and through this?
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good counsel, and good counsel for all of us in lots of situations. You and I were in a meeting not too long ago, and a colleague shared some action points that needed to be attended to. And I remember the anxiety rising within me because I knew that I could not instantaneously fix those things. They were all legitimate concerns. They were things that needed to be dealt with. And I realized I can't fix all those things. I need to fix all those things. All of those things need to be fixed. I can't fix them right now. Right. And I think even, as husbands, when you're, we like to fix things. Yes. And sometimes you have to own up to your own inability to be able to have an immediate resolve to something. Right. And that's probably, even in the context of pastoral counseling, it's easy to get frustrated with somebody who you can't seem to solve what it is that they're dealing with. Right. You have to give yourself some distance between that desire to resolve and the issue that they're facing.
That concept of distance, maybe that's another really good practical thing I tell folks that come through our program. Look, this client was suffering before they came to you for a long time. They'll probably experience suffering long after they stop seeing you. You're here for a time to offer them something that hopefully is helpful to them.
Yep.
And, it's not your responsibility to fix them.
Right. Okay, the questions have been pouring in, Mike. Yes. So I'm just gonna jump right in. Thanks, CL, for sending it. For some reason, my Q&A feature isn't working on. I will work on this later, CL, but I can't see your Q&A things right now. So CL's relaying these to me, and I appreciate you doing it. But here's the first one, Mike. Would you please comment on what your scholarship and clinical experience may have revealed on two particular points? First, the connection between anxiety in society generally and declining biblical faith. And second, the connection between anxiety in the church and declining vibrant reliance on providence and assured eschatological hope.
Okay, well, so double-barrel question, but we'll turn here. So the first, I think we commented some already about the relationship between smartphone technology and anxiety. But I mean, absolutely, Ligon, adolescents today, you know this, are facing things that you and I never even dreamed of.
Absolutely.
Their reality is so different with what they're exposed to, the quantity of it, the extremeness of it, the depravity of much of it. And so I believe, I don't have empirical data to support this, but in my kind of judgment of things, it is not a surprise to me that we unleashed the entirety of the internet, which has some wonderful qualities to it, but also has some deeply dark, evil aspects to it. Yeah. We unleashed all of that on children, on an entire generation of children, and now suddenly we've got like skyrocketing anxiety. Like, I'm just not that surprised. Second question, Rita, give me the second one again.
Yeah, it's the connection between anxiety in the church and maybe a declining sense of trusting in God's providence and the hope of the future and of the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah, in our Western desire for our kind of own individualistic control over life and kind of our experience of it, we want to get away from that idea of God's sovereignty, and we want to kind of go in a different direction. And I don't think it's intended. An unintended consequence of that is that you lose that groundedness of I am loved. God is not surprised by anything that's happening to me. This is part of his plan, and it will all be made right. And I think without that, we are more prone to anxiety. I can tell you how much, I can't quantify that, but yeah, I think that's part of
it. Here's another one, and it asks you basically to reflect a little bit on, is there a distinction between anxiety and worry? So here's how the question goes. Anxiety is a diagnosable condition, but what about worry? How do we respond to those in the church who describe themselves as chronic worriers?
I think there's an overlap there, although I will acknowledge that chronic worrier might not be diagnosable with generalized anxiety disorder, some other disorder. But there's definitely there's the reason they tend to worry, and that often has to do with some sense of, if I'm not worrying about it, then something bad is going to happen. That sense of threat, right? What do I say to that person? I think I spend a long time initially listening to that person to really understand what it is that is driving the worry. And then I think after a time, I'll begin to gently press into some belief that person has that underlies that worry, whatever it might be, and see if they can kind of reframe what they believe there to be more in line with the reality of our existence under a good and gracious God.
Here's the third question. What lessons can we learn from King David's anxieties in the Psalms?
Well, I guess the first that comes to my mind is, it ain't nothing new.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, if you experience anxiety or depression and, you feel like you're an oddball because of that, just go read the Psalms, because it is all over the Psalms. The second thing I'd say is the Psalms give us this idea of lament, this biblically sanctioned way of engaging with God about things that distress us. And that does not involve pretending that those things don't happen or that I don't feel that way, right? It involves expressing trust in God, but then coming back and expressing the complaint again. And, and there's a pattern there of And it's not really that different than what I just said, in that, God hears those laments, and he listens, right? And that's what we're to do when we're on the other side of that, listening to a person lamenting their distress, is we're to hear them, and then as they've had time to process it, then you can start to look at other things.
It's good. And I think along the lines of your comment earlier, how people have remarked that it is helped that you have listened patiently and sympathetically and carefully and even asked questions. I think it is interesting that God directs many psalm writers to write down their anxiety in detail and sing it to him when everybody gathers together to worship, so that everybody knows he is listening to our cry. He is attending to our plea. He knows in detail what it is that is discouraging us and causing us to be downcast. He is not ignoring us. He does care about it. He, in fact, commands us to bring that to him and to sing it to him. And he can say, I can take it. You sing it to me. I can take it. And
he's a big God. It's not gonna bother. Right.
Yeah. Really important.
Down, Ligon, by the way. That has an effect.
Yeah.
You have a bunch of stuff running in your head and it's just spinning. To actually express it and put it down on paper. I have students do this. So they'll write out their own psalm of lament.
Write it down. Yep.
And there's something relieving about that.
That's good. Okay, you've made a comment already about the correlation between social media and anxiety. So I'm going to move on to the next question from there. Here's a person who says, in my upbringing, I often heard that anxiety was a sin and that I wasn't trusting God enough. How do we differentiate between a diagnosed anxiety or depression and a general sense of anxiety because of situations in life?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this gets into an area that's probably a little controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and go into it just a touch. Look, when we feel anxious, as I said earlier, we were not meant to kind of feel anxious in that way, right, before the fall. And when that anxiety is there, it's because of the fall, and that puts it into the category of sin, and perhaps a more a natural sin side of things, right, where it's maybe perhaps biological response, but it's still not morally neutral, right? It's not. We're told very clearly that we're not to feel that and to kind of sit in that. And so that, I'll say that on the one hand, right? But that's different than a volitional sin where you're choosing to ruminate and remain anxious, right? Like, yeah, they're both sin, but they're not kind of the same thing in my mind. And so when you have a person who, for whatever reason, is experiencing chronic anxiety that is unwanted, that they've tried to change, they're repentant of, and it remains, to call that like a volitional sin, I think is wrong. But that doesn't mean that it's not part of the fall either, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. Here's another question. I have 3 teens at home, all dealing with some level of anxiety due to public school culture. Mm-hmm. We work diligently as a family to talk through experienced issues from a biblical framework. At what point should I be alarmed? Or I think the person means to sort of be put on alarm that my children need professional help, or what are some great resources available for parents with teens?
Okay, another double barrel question here, but
yeah.
So the first, when should I start wondering if I should intervene in some way, right?
Yeah.
And I would say if that child or adolescent starts to experience I guess the best word I can come up with is disruption in their ability to function in school or to function in relationships, and to function in the family. If their sleep is affected, if their appetite is affected, if their mood is affected in significant ways for more than, let's say 4 weeks or so, then you're probably dealing with something there that's not just a transient mood state, but you're probably dealing with something that's more serious. What should you do, and what resources are available? Well, let's see. So I love that this person is already talking with their kids about this stuff right off the bat. I would add to that, encouraging them to talk about the anxiety, to talk about what that child is experiencing in the way that we've been describing. If that kind of ability to kind of engage with it with their family doesn't help reduce the anxiety to something more manageable, you could look at going to a professional counselor at that point. My own kids found a lot of support in their youth group and youth pastor, right? And would go often to Billy Meenan was the guy who was the
great guy.
Yeah, right. And
great guy.
He was such a blessing and support to all 4 of my kids. That's I think a huge resource often for teens. A pastor would be a good person to go to, a mentor. This interacting in public schools, and honestly, like you and I know, it happens in private schools too. It's not
it does
to public schools.
Happens everywhere.
It happens everywhere. It's such a tough thing as a parent to watch your kids go through, and so I'd say to that parent also, make sure that you're getting support for yourself, right? Yeah. You don't go through this alone. Make sure you're talking to your pastor, or if you're having any symptoms, you can potentially talk to a counselor.
This person asks a question about when it's helpful to seek the service of a clinical counselor alongside of pastoral care. Can you think of some things that might be helpful to say along those lines? There may be a case where a pastor feels that, hey, this person could really benefit from seeing a professional counselor. I'm not trying to hand this person off and sort of wash my hands of this dear brother or sister, but how would that work together in a constructive way?
So I would say to a pastor or to someone who's seen a pastor, that if you have been in dialogue with that pastor for a time, and you continue to experience anxiety or whatever it may be, despite kind of knowing what the word says about your relationship with God or your status in terms of salvation, how the world will be, if all these things we've been talking about, if you continue to experience it, that's probably the time to bring in as a partner a professional counselor. That professional counselor in no way takes on the spiritual leadership and discipleship that a pastor's is. That's what they do. That is the essence of their relationship. The counselors are trying to help that person address and reduce those anxiety symptoms, and hopefully, if everything goes the way it's supposed to, it's a short or medium term engagement.
What about people who have anxiety that make it hard for them even to relate to somebody who's very loving in a position of spiritual authority? This question says, if as a pastor, a congregant has anxiety in interacting with authority, even loving interaction, what is a good way to minister to them so that their anxiety is not exacerbated?
Okay, so as a professor, I have students that come and they will often experience the same thing with me.
Yep.
I'm sure you see this, Ligon, right?
Yep.
And So why does that happen, and what do you do about it? Well, one, it almost always happens because they've had negative experiences with people in authority figures, particularly men, right? So they come to this program. I happen to be 6'4", 200 pounds, 200 plus pounds, and they encounter me, and if they've had a lot of negative experiences with a male, they can have all kinds of stuff firing off in their head that's not conscious, right? It's just creating anxiety. And I'm very sympathetic to that, right? I've been around this long enough to know that that's going to happen for some people. And so I'm very patient with that. And I try to help them talk about how they're feeling around me, and kind of normalize, hey, it's okay if you're feeling anxious around me, even though I'm treating you well right now, and kind of just give them permission to feel it and to be able to talk about it, like we were saying earlier, to express it. And then that often helps reduce it. I think I tell that person, I don't know this, obviously, the situation in particular, but if they can have interaction with that person who is anxious in a place where they feel safe, if that's at home, if they would prefer to meet maybe in a restaurant, something where they have kind of a greater sense of safety. That has nothing to do with me. It really is trying to help their brain kind of settle down. And then the more time they spend with me that is actually loving and safe, their brain over time will tend to kind of reduce anxiety.
If I can give a personal testimony to how a counselor helped me here, I had a congregation member that I knew had a bad experience with someone in spiritual authority in the past. And a counselor was working with her, and he called me and he said, hey, my client is a little bit intimidated by you and isn't sure where they stand with you. Now, interestingly, when I first met his client in another context years before, I sensed her uneasiness around me. And so he said, would you mind if I brought her, if we set up an appointment, I came with her to the office and y'all just sit down and talk together? I said, of course, sure. And so he came in, we sat down together, and I decided I'd put cards on the table. And I said, when we first met, my read was I wasn't your cup of tea. But I want you to know I liked you immediately, and I still do. And it was like the ice was completely broken, Mike. Right. And we have been friends ever since.
Right.
But that counselor really helped me out. I don't think I ever could have gotten there if that counselor hadn't called me up and then came along with her. So because there was some intimidation there, and she trusted him, because they had cultivated a relationship, and he liked me and knew me really well. He really helped me out with that congregation member in a way I'm not sure I could have gotten through.
Well, and it seems you addressed some very deep belief that she had, that maybe you didn't like her, right? Or that something along those lines that you, in that encounter, it just melted away. And that's praise God.
We can really help one another. And sometimes it takes the third, person there to make those things happen, because of things that people are bringing into a relationship from the past. It goes back to what you said earlier about how things from the past can really impact the way you process anxiety now or experience anxiety now. Anything that you want to say by way of how pastors and elders and people in the church can help support those who are suffering from anxiety?
Well, I think if a person who suffers from anxiety knows that they have a pastor or elders who know and care about the person, directly, whom they can be honest with, even when they know they should not continue to feel anxious, and yet they do, and to be able to trust that they're going to be received and cared for, that's probably the best thing I can think of. Now, that can be a burden to a person in leadership, if you have someone who for years and years and years is constantly anxious. That they're kind of like, I'm sure you've had this, like, where they're kind of trying to kind of unload all that anxiety on you, and I'm not suggesting that we should try to be some kind of a receptacle for that.
Yeah.
Because I think when that's happening, that is one of those times you probably are going to say, it seems like this is something that would benefit from talking to a counselor. Again, not to get rid of you. I want to continue to be in relationship with you, but I don't think that what we're doing is really getting to whatever this is.
Yeah, that's so good. Boy, this is a poignant question, Mike, for those who have felt the call to ministry, like a youth pastor or to the pastoral ministry, who struggle with anxiety. Is that disqualifying? Can God still use that person in the midst of having anxiety or depression?
I believe yes, unreservedly. I think God uses broken vessels, and I think we're all broken. It's just we're broken in different ways, right? And now, look, if you're crippled by anxiety, I'm not saying that like there aren't times when perhaps that could be disqualifying, but it would really involve it being so severe and lasting so long that you're unable to really perform your duties. But the fact that it's there, I think if you are continuing to try to address it, and you're kind of doing all that you're able, and you're able to function in the role, and you're open about it with your leadership, I'd love to hear what you think, though, Ligon.
No, what I would add to that is, I think that one of the tricks with anxiety is it can cause you to misread things that other people are doing towards you.
Right.
And you want to really attend to that. If that's your issue and you're wanting to go into ministry, don't just brush that aside like it's not going to have an impact on you. It is. Right. You've got to be able to recognize goodwill being expressed towards you. You've got to be able to endure the normal discouragements that come with pastoral ministry. There's always that person at the door of the church who the one thing they want to talk to you about is the one thing that you did wrong or didn't do well or need to do better or whatever. And if your anxiety doesn't allow you to endure those kinds of interactions, it's going to be hard on you. And then it's going to be hard on you to know how to serve other people, because your perceptions are. So that's where good counseling is super important in that setting, because you've got to be able to have your antenna have to kind of work to be able to do pastoral work. And I'm sure it's the same for you and the people that you're training in the clinic, right?
Absolutely.
They've got to be able to diagnose and read people's what their concerns are, and sometimes help people understand things that they don't understand themselves. And if your anxiety blocks you from being able to do that, then you got to keep working on that anxiety.
Yeah, we talked earlier about it. If something gets stirred up in me as a counselor or a pastor that causes me to react in ways that are really not good, then that's not okay. And your point is that if you do have chronic anxiety or intense anxiety, that you're more prone to react that way. I think that's a good point, Ligon, that while I don't want to say you're immediately disqualified, if you are unable to tolerate criticism, if you're misreading people's intentions when they talk to you, that's a problem.
So it's, again, it's just a good reminder. All of us have things, as you just said, all of us have our stuff. It's really important for us to know what our stuff is when we're serving in ministry and how it makes us react. And because ultimately we want to be able to serve other people, and anything that keeps us from being able to serve other people the way we want to serve, we want to address that. And it may be, like, by the way, a ton of other things, something that you have to keep working on your whole life.
Right.
But I just self-awareness, I think, is something that is super important for people who are going into the ministry, especially knowing what our deficits and limitations are. And we've all got them, right? Every single one of us have them, but we need to know what those are so that we can serve other people. Well, I've run you right up to the 1 o'clock hour, Mike, and I know that you have something to do. So I'm going to hand it right back to CL. Thank you, CL.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Thank you so much, Dr. Hillerman, for your great insights. Okay, so next month's online discussion forum is going to be called the Aaronic Benediction in Corporate Worship. We're going to have one of our RTS Orlando professors, the Reverend Mike Glodo, with us. He's actually just written a new book. I have it right here. It's called The Lord Bless You and Keep You, Gospel Promises from the Aaronic Blessing. So he will be also joined with our professor of pastoral theology, Dr. Charlie Wingard. That will be September 14th, again on a Thursday at noon. Hope to see you next month. Thank you guys so much for coming.